Okay, hi, welcome. It is Wednesday. This is our third live broadcast. It is 8:02, and I don't have anybody currently logged in, but as you are watching, one thing I would like to remind you, if you are watching, it would be very helpful to us if you could go ahead and log in so that we can see and get some analytics about how many people are actually viewing and that kind of stuff. It kind of helps us to kind of track that, do a little research on who are we reaching and how many people and some things like that. So if you could figure out, go ahead and log in as you're doing that, and that'd be great. Okay. Just take care of a few things here on my screen. It's a little funky, so okay. So today we don't have a lot of questions so far. I'm hoping they will appear as we go along. So we started with, let me refresh this real quick and make sure how many new messages we might actually have. Okay. Interesting. All right, so let's start with, so Christopher has a question that's kind of going to be very specific to him, and I will get to that in a second. Looks like Joe has a question as well. So let me start with Joe's question, which is, what are some types of primary primary economic activities? So the next unit or the next set of videos that we have produced and put out on the web are ones that are connected with agriculture. So I highly recommend that you watch those. So agriculture is a primary economic activity. And what that basically means is, all right, I'm sorry. Okay, what types of economic activities are is that we can kind of divide how people make their living and how they survive into some broad categories. Okay, one of those is primary. And so what Joe's question really is about, what does that look like? What does that primary look like? And so one of the things to remember is that primary activities are the most basic, and that's not meant to be a value judgment or evaluative in any way. It's just meant to honestly say that the most primitive, simplest, most basic ways that people make money or provide for their families, things like that, is through primary activities. Okay, so around the world there are lots of different types of primary activities. The one thing that I want us to remember, though, is that primary activities are extractive in nature, which means that they rely on pulling resources out of the ground. Okay, so the idea of pulling resources out of the ground. So it might be, for example, mining. So you dig a big hole in the ground, you hammer on some rocks for a while, and valuable stuff comes out. Okay, that's an example. The primary activity might be timber, so logging, lumberjacking, things like that. So taking trees and forests, cutting them down. Okay, we're extracting from the natural environment. Some more examples might be fishing is a primary economic activity. You're going out to the ocean with big nets and big boats, and you're harvesting fish and bringing them onto the boat and things like that. And so that's another form of primary economic activity. Agriculture is another one of these. You go out, you plant, and you harvest, and you bring in crops. Now, one of the things that's important to point out about the difference between primary activities and other types of activities is that primary does not result in the processing of raw materials. It is simply the acquiring or harvesting of them. Harvesting, not processing. So we're going to go out and dig stuff out of the ground. We're going to put it on a truck and we're going to send it someplace else. Somebody else is going to process that into steel or into aluminum or into something else. We're going to go out and catch a bunch of fish. We're going to dump them off the boat and they're going to be shipped off someplace else to make cans of tuna or, salmon patties or, Long John Silver's cod thing. I'm not a fish fan, so I'm making these things up. But so those are extractive. Same thing with agriculture, or with agriculture. Agriculture also is extractive. You go out, you harvest the crops, you send it off. Somebody else makes the bread. Somebody else processes it into meat. Somebody else does that. Those are secondary activities. So when we talk about primary activities, we're talking about the actual process by which we take raw materials out of the ground or the ocean or other types of places and send them off someplace else. So it's the actual labor-intensive work of producing. Now, primary agriculture or primary economic activities are very important to any economic system because that's where the resources come from. But there's some downsides to primary. One is they are very environmentally impactful. Okay. If you're digging a big hole in the ground and you're pulling out all the stuff that's of any value, then that's going to do damage. If you are, cutting down trees, that's going to create damage. So this idea of primary activities has a huge impact on the environment. Also, in the bigger picture, you don't particularly want to have an economy that is based heavily on primary activities, right? So you don't want 50, 60, 70 or more % of your income, of your economic base coming from primary activities. A couple of reasons for this. One is this requires relatively low-skilled labor. And when we talk about low-skilled labor, it does not mean that people are bad at their jobs. It doesn't mean they're dumb. It means that they don't have a lot of formal education, right? And in our economic system, there is a direct correlation most of the time between the amount of education that you have and the wages and your earning potential. So when you have a economic system that's based on primary economic activities, what you really are doing is you're basing your economy around people that don't make much money. Okay. And the reason for this is they may be very good at that. They may be very good at cutting down trees, but they don't have a lot of flexibility in their skills, or they don't have a lot of flexibility in their ability to do different types of things, or things that might be more scarce, things that might be higher paying, things that might be more valued within a particular economic system. All right. So that is one of the kind of the downsides and one of the dangers of relying too heavily on primary economic activities. The best types of economies are ones that are diverse. So you have some primary, you have some secondary, you have some tertiary, some quaternary, things like that. In general, the strongest, most developed, especially Western economies, have kind of moved beyond primary for the most part, and pretty much beyond secondary as well. So if you look at major countries like Western Europe, if you look at the United States, if you look at Canada, Japan, maybe even North Korea, or no, not North Korea, no, South Korea, sorry, or Taiwan, what you'll see is that they're beginning to move, they either have or are beginning to move away from manufacturing for some of the same reasons, and moving into tertiary and quaternary industries, which require higher levels of skill, higher levels of education, but therefore are also going to be higher paying and a stronger base for an economy. So keeping in mind that the more money people make in your society, the more tax dollars you can bring in, the more money you can spend on nice roads, nice schools, nice houses, nice buildings, nice statues, public things like that. So that's kind of how those economic systems work. In general, if you find yourself in a country that is primarily economic, you're going to find yourself long term at a disadvantage relative to others, and in terms of an internal growth. Okay, yeah. So that's that. So I hope that answered your question. That was Joe's question, correct? Yes, it was. Okay. Hope that answers your question, Joe, about what primary economies are. Another couple other things that might fall into that category is so pastoralism, so herding and stuff like that, small scale animal production could be considered that as well. And the products that come out of that could also be considered that. Okay, so I have a question here from MJ, which goes nicely with a question that seems to have gone away about agriculture. So once again, agriculture is our next online unit in terms of what's going to go up online in terms of videos. So I really recommend that you watch those. But because you're here, I do want to go ahead and respond to your question. Once again, I have 4 people viewing now. Awesome, thank you. It's good to see you. Once again, I want to remind you to go ahead and log in so we can have some analytics of who's watching and be able to track some of that. Not like we're going to like spy on you, but you know, we just want to be able to target and efficiently reach the people that are interested in what we have to say. So anyway, all right. So and then MJ's question is about Sweden agriculture, and Sweden is, as I understand, this is kind of one of those funny words that kind of has some different meanings, like how specific is it, and you know things like that. So what this basically is this is a type of subsistence agriculture. And subsistence basically means you're only producing enough for you and yourself and your family, maybe a little bit for your village, maybe a little bit of surplus, but any surplus is usually not enough to sell for any kind of significant profit. So it falls into this category. And Sweden is what we call falls into a category that is very common in places like tropical regions such as sub-Saharan Africa, such as Central America, such as Southeast Asia, and it's associated with a process known as what has kind of popularly been known as what's called slash and burn. And basically what happens is the soil itself is not very high quality. It's not very good. But people still have to eke out a living on this soil. So what they do is they will work an area for a certain amount of time, maybe 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, or whatever, until the nutrients in the soil have kind of been exhausted, and then they move on. And so there's kind of 3 steps to this process. I actually was a grader on a free response question a few years ago about subsistence agriculture. And basically there were 3 parts to the process. One is, how do we clear the land? We have the land. It is natural. It may have trees. It may have stumps. It may have shrubs. It may have all kinds of things. And traditionally, what we associate with that clearing process is what's called slash and burn, which is we go through, we clear out as much as we can by hand or with small machines, and then we burn off the rest. And what that does is it leaves the soil and the ground clear for cultivation, but also that burning process and the organic material that comes out of that burning process returns to the soil, and it makes the soil more fertile for that time. Okay, so that actually improves the quality of the soil for that time. Then the second part of the process is the actual cultivation. You'll go into this and you will farm it fairly intensively for as long as you can. And then as the soil begins to wear out, as it begins to lose its fertility, then you leave that land and you find a new place to repeat the process. But in the process of doing that, you let that land go back to nature. So you let the natural vegetation return, you let the trees grow back, the brushes, the shrubs, the grass, eventually the animals will return, and whatever else naturally lives in that place. And what's happening is as that happens, the fertility that you have spent years taking out of the soil is now being returned. And so theoretically, you could return to this plot of land at some time in the future. Now, it may be 20, 30, 40 years. It may even, in some cases, be a generational thing where my grandfather farmed this land. My father didn't because it hadn't returned to fertility yet, but now I am able to go back to these same spots and cultivate. So that's kind of the idea of Swidden. Swidden is a very similar concept. There's really not much difference between that and other forms of this not intensive subsistence, but just subsistence that exists in these tropical climates where the soil quality is very, very poor. So if you were to see a map of this, you'd see some large bands around the equator where you would see this type of activity kind of occurring. And so that's one of several different types of economic activities that does occur. That we label as primary is this type of subsistence. Okay, all right. So MJ, I hope that answers your question. Just think about being a nomadic farmer. I mean that sounds like an odd concept because we tend to think of farmers being settled, but you're I guess going to be semi-nomadic because you're going to be in one place, but not for many, many generations. You're going to be in one place for a relatively short period of time. In the big scheme of things, and then you're going to move on to someplace else, and then you're going to go someplace else, and then you're going to go someplace else. Okay, so I hope that answers your question. If not, feel free to chime in on the question page and clarify so that I can give you a little more information. Okay, so the next question on the board here, and I have tried very hard to figure out how to do some screencasting, but I haven't really been able to. Technology, I love it, but I'm not always the best at it. So anyway, the next question is kind of specific, and so I'm going to try to address it in a way that is beneficial to people that are in our specific region here in North Texas and those who are not. Hopefully the information that I'm going to toss out there is helpful to all different groups of people. So the question is from Christopher, and Christopher apparently is taking a field trip. I don't know if it's tomorrow. Yes, it is tomorrow. Okay. Well, good luck with that, Christopher. I love field trips. My kind of rule of the day is leave your drama at home on the field trip. Don't ruin everybody else's trip because you have drama. Not that I'm saying Christopher has drama, but pass that word on to your friends. If you got drama, save it for your mama and don't take it on the field trip, because this is supposed to be like the single most joyous day on the planet. We get to go out and do stuff and not be in school, but it's still be in school at the same time. Let's not mess this up. Okay. Anyway, so getting back to Christopher's specific question, which deals with urban urban geography. Now, urban is a huge concept in human geography. It'll be the last one that we cover as part of our review in a few weeks. And basically, it looks like Christopher's school and the human geography classes are taking a trip to Dallas. Christopher apparently lives or attends school in Louisville, which is a suburb of Dallas on the north side of Dallas, and will be attending on a field trip to observe, in quotation marks, urban geography. Well, that is an awesome trip. I wish I could come. In fact, I may just show up tomorrow and hop on the bus with you or something. That would be kind of creepy, though. They'd be like, "Who is this weird guy? I don't know him. Maybe he's a stranger, and so just don't take candy from him." No, anyway. So you will be traveling to Dallas and doing some different types of things. So I'm going to talk about a couple of concepts in urban geography, Christopher, that you might encounter as you go. And these concepts are going to be applicable to other people as well. So don't think that these are Dallas-specific concepts or Dallas-specific ideas. So the first thing, Christopher, is you're probably going to be traveling down I-35 since your school is not far from there. And Interstate 35 is a very long highway. It goes from Mexico all the way up to Canada, and it's called the NAFTA highway to some people. But it splits when it gets in the Dallas-Fort Worth area into 35W, which is in Fort Worth, and 35E or East, which is in Dallas. But you'll probably be traveling down 35. So here's some interesting things to think about. One is to think about the relationship between transportation and urban environments and the roles that highways and other types of transportation arteries, what do they mean? So one of the things that I would think would be kind of cool for you to do, and you might want to think about, is to look at a map. Look at a map of the highway system in Dallas, and this goes for anybody. If you live in a major urban area, look at the highway system. What is the shape of the highway system? Where do the roads go? Do they make circles? Are they straight lines? Where do they intersect and why do they intersect? And look at what types of things are going on at those intersections. What types of economic activities? What types of residential activities? Who lives where? What kind of housing? What kind of are they houses? Are they apartments? Are they high rises? Just kind of look at those intersections and why are they there. Also, as you're looking at, kind of the highway system and the road system going into one of these cities, look at where it seems to be concentrated. Look for places where lots of roads and highways converge. Okay, so in Dallas, what you want to look for is where I-35, I-30, I-45, and US 75 all kind of converge within a couple of mile area in the middle of Dallas. Okay, this is going to be a very important concept. This is going to be your central business district. At least that's what it would have been 50, 75 years ago. And basically the central business district is kind of the central economic hub of an urban area. So as you're traveling down 35, you're going to pass highways, and eventually those highways will converge. When you get to that convergent point, okay, you might go on a highway called Woodall Rogers. You might spend some time on I-30. You might spend some time on 75 or on I-30 on I-45. Look around you in those places. Look at the kinds of buildings that you see. Look at the kinds of houses and types of businesses that you see. That 50 years ago, this is where most of the economic activity was really important and was really the center of everything. And so what we've seen over time is that the economies of urban areas have begun to spread out and spread not just out from the center, but to the suburbs. And so you will have seen some shifting over time. So you might, I know a lot about Louisville. I grew up not far from there, and so I know that the town that you live in is much larger than it was 30 years ago. When I lived not far from there, and so a lot of the growth that has occurred there in the suburban parts of the town is economic activity that moved or spread from that central business district in the south. So as you're traveling, think about that. Think about as your bus is driving down the highway, notice what's in front of you. Notice you converging into this really densely populated, very densely urban area. Watch the traffic. How much traffic is around you? You'll probably see a whole lot as you get further south. The other thing that's interesting about Dallas, and is that we do have a public transportation rail system in Dallas. It's not that great, I have to be honest with you. But considering that in Texas, we don't like to spend money on anything, especially not things that benefit lots of people, then it's not that bad. For those of you who live in a city with a really good public transportation system, you feel fortunate and take advantage of that. But we do have one. And if you look at a map, a DART map, DART stands for Dallas Area Rapid Transit. If you look at a map of the DART rail grid in Dallas, you'll see some of those things as well. You'll see where the rail lines converge, where the commuter rail lines converge, and they'll converge in some of those kinds of places. The other thing to think of, another thing to think about, is the idea of what is called sinks and dinks. And SINK stands for single income, no kids. DINK stands for dual income, no kids. And so basically these are people that don't have children. They're usually college educated. And because they don't have children, they probably have more of what we would call disposable income. So if you were not already aware of this, children are very expensive, especially teenagers. And so that's why I don't have any, because, you know, I just would rather spend the money on me. Sorry about that. Anyway, but so sinks and dinks. So think about if you were a single income person, if you were a dual income person, what types of things would you want to surround yourself with, right? Are you going to want to live next to a little league park? Are you going to want to live next to high quality schools? Are you going to want to live next to the Chuck E. Cheese or things like that, right? Probably not. If you are a sink or a dink, you have very different tastes in your urban environment. Okay, and what you look for. So people that are interested in that first set of things, the schools and the Chuck E. Cheese and the Little League Park, are not going to live in densely populated urban areas. They're going to live on the edges of cities and suburbs. Okay, and so when you get into the city center, what you'll notice is very different types of businesses, very different types of entertainment, very different type of residence. Okay, you're more likely to live in an apartment building as opposed to a house. Okay, and part of the reason for this is as you get closer to the central business district, the land value and the cost of land gets very, very expensive. And so one way around this is to have a building with a small footprint on the ground, but is built up. All right, and so what you'll find is having a house in a densely populated urban area is incredibly expensive. Having an apartment is usually more affordable. It's also temporary, so that if you do decide that you're done being a sink or a dink and you want to have a family, you can much easier change your situation. But think about the types of entertainment options. So things that single people would do that families might do less. So if you go downtown in Dallas, one of the things that you might do tomorrow is you might drive through or around what's called the Arts District. The Arts District is right there in the middle of downtown. It has some really great music venues, such as the Winspear Opera House, such as the Meyerson Symphony Center. There are multiple museums there, such as the Dallas Museum of Art, such as the Nasher Sculpture Garden, all really cool places. And not that you can't take kids to these places, they're just not designed for children, right? Children's attention spans and, you know, things like that are just not usually cohesive or conducive to these places. So sinks and dinks are going to have different types of interests in what they're looking for. The types of restaurants are going to be different. You're less likely to have, you know, your Chili's or Fridays or Bennigan's or, you know, those kind of things, and more, you know, mom and pop kind of places. More, you're also might be more likely to have more at the same time older buildings or older houses, older homes, and at the same time very, very new ones, as we see the process of what is known as gentrification going on. Gentrification is this process of urban renewal that sinks and dinks often heavily participate in because they have this disposable income. And gentrification is the process by which people with income will come in to older urban areas that have been run down or have been abandoned, and will invest lots of money in, you know, restoring old homes or building nice new stuff, and making it, instead of a area populated by poorer or lower income people, but this becomes popular with younger, more middle to higher income people. And this has some positive and negatives. From a urban planning perspective, it's great because your land values go up, and you're attracting more of a tax base, both from business taxes and from personal income taxes. But the downside of that is that now people that used to live in that neighborhood when it was poorer or more run down can no longer afford to live there. So they have to find someplace else. So that's one of the downsides of gentrification. There are two kind of neighborhoods in Dallas. Actually, there's lots of these neighborhoods in Dallas, but two that you might see if you are going on a trip downtown is you might go through Uptown. And Uptown is just north of that Woodall Rogers area and just north of Clive Warren Park, which is a very, very cool place. You should beg and plead your teachers to let you go to Clive Warren Park. It's very cool. And so Uptown is one of these areas. And then there's an area just north of Uptown called Oak Lawn. And Oak Lawn is actually an interesting case in that a lot of gentrification is correlated with the movement of the LGBT community, so the gay, lesbian, transgendered community. So basically, you have gay individuals or gay couples that are often don't have children, but often have disposable income, so they fall into the sinks and dinks categories, and they are often the moving force behind gentrification. Oak Lawn is one of these particular neighborhoods in Dallas where there is a higher than average concentration of LGBT population, and so that's kind of just a trend that we see in other cities as well that is also alive and well here in Dallas. Another thing that you might see or might go by tomorrow is a place called Lower Greenville, which is an older part of Dallas, just just east of US 75 on Greenville Avenue. And Greenville is kind of different in that most of the homes there are older. They've been restored and are in pretty good shape, but there's not a lot of multifamily or apartments in that part of town. It's very close to Southern Methodist University. It's very close to Northwest Highway and some very popular kind of places for small families or sinks and dinks to live that don't want to live downtown. So those are something to think about. Another thing that you might want to do as you're driving in the bus is look at the height of buildings. Look at and maybe even take like a notepad or a spiral with you, and as you're driving, kind of chart what the buildings are doing. They're flat at the top. When you start, they'll probably be mostly 1 or 2 story buildings. As you get closer and closer and closer, once again, you'll see that shift in those buildings occurring, and you'll see them getting taller and taller and taller until you get to that central business district downtown, which is where you might see, Reunion Tower, which is like the big microphone-looking building for Dallasites and things like that. Anyway, so those are some concepts to think about and some real-world applications as you on your field trip tomorrow. Some other things that you'll want to think about in some of the bigger picture of urbanization is urbanization over time. And looking at, this is where urban models come in, is that a lot of urban models kind of have a chronological effect to them. So if we start with the Burgess model with the CBD and then these concentric rings that move out from that central point, then it kind of morphs into what we call the Hoyt or sector model. Sector model is tied very closely to that idea of transportation, and it looks like big pie pieces coming out of the center of the pie, and those pie pieces very closely correlate or correspond to where those major transportation arteries are. So there'll be a pie that runs along a highway, a pie that runs along a major train route or train depot, and the land values are very closely associated with that. This, once again, these two models assume that the central business district is still the primary economic center of the city or of the urban environment. Okay, then we have what's called the multi-nuclei model, where that central business district begins to decrease in its economic influence, and other areas sporadically around the urban center begin to pop up as kind of secondary CBDs or secondary areas, and then we begin to see more and more outward spreading of that until we get to what's called the urban realms model. Urban realms model is just massive, massive urban areas. So if you ever get a chance to look at a map of Los Angeles, which is just immense in its geographical spread. It's a good example of urban realms, and that every there's all of these independent areas with their own CBDs and their own economic interests, but they're all kind of connected in this web of the larger metropolitan area and the larger urban area. Also, think about the idea of suburbanization. Think about which really occurs after World War II. So after World War II, as soldiers are coming back from fighting the war, we see the U.S. government beginning to subsidize and really promote, one, women going back home and raising families and becoming stay-at-home moms for two reasons. One, that was just the general ethos of the time, but two, they needed to clear up to provide jobs for returning soldiers. So the women that had been in the factories were then kind of encouraged to go home, become stay-at-home moms, have families and kids and things like that. Nothing wrong with that. So what we end up seeing is that, as we said earlier, urban centers and urban cores and densely populated places are really not conducive to raising families, or at least that was the perception of them after World War II. We have this huge highway boom that allows people to live further away from the CBD and still work there. So we see people and their families moving further and further and further out into new homes that are being built at a alarmingly fast rate in the 1950s and 60s. And so we see this suburbanization occurring as more and more people are migrating. Another couple of concepts that are associated with this is the idea of white flight. And no, that's not racist. That's just a term. And what that meant at the time was, in the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s, there was still, and as there still is today, a large income disparity between white residents of citizens of cities, and African American, Hispanic, other minority groups. A huge income disparity. So what ended up happening was the people that left the urban centers and left the urban areas were those that could afford to. The ones that could afford reliable transportation, the one that could afford homes in the suburbs, and so they left. And the people that left were overwhelmingly white Anglos. And so what you see is this idea of white flight, which is a movement, a mass migration of white upper income individuals from the city center to the suburbs. Now, the downside of this is that as they did that, they take tax revenue with them. So we see some issues in terms of cities now being able to provide proper services in the cities now that the average income of the residents has dropped to, now that there are more higher percentage of lower income residents. So they are having trouble. They would then have trouble for providing services. They would have a harder time providing quality schools, which is really the biggest kind of tragedy of this process. And unless you think that I am, kind of exaggerating, this was very, very common that realtors back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and really until it was outlawed, would actually encourage, would use kind of fear of different groups and fear of race to persuade people. So the first time a family of color might move onto the block, then realtors would start to, pressure people. Hey, look at this neighborhood. You don't want to live here anymore. Which is incredibly horrible and incredibly racist and wrong, and not something we should ever promote. But was definitely a driving force in the development of suburbs in the United States. And this idea of, we want the idyllic life. We want a house and a picket fence and a swing set, and we want to live near a park, and we want to play Little League, and we want to go to this type of school, and we want to go to Chuck E. Cheese on Saturday, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's completely fine. It's I think natural and completely acceptable for people to want to provide the best possible opportunities for themselves and for their families. One of the problems that kind of urbanization and the urban unit kind of points out is the way that these opportunities are not equal. And so some people are able to gain access to these to a better life because of this process than others. So you may or may not see that, you know, on your trip to Dallas. A lot of the area around downtown has been gentrified, has gone through some renewal. If you get kind of south of I-30, you might run into that. If you go into far east Dallas, if you go into far west Dallas, then you might see some lower income areas where some of these kind of structural problems are still in existence. And some of those kinds of things. So suburbanization, this kind of overall spreading and changing of the look of the city and the model of the city as time goes on, building height and how that relates to bid rent and the price of land and what that does to the shape and look of cities. Thinking about that historical arc and timeline of how those city models develop. Understanding what types of economic activities different people are looking for and how and where they find those things. One of the things that we're also seeing is that more and more retired people are moving back to the city. Once again, they're sinks and dinks on the opposite end, not sinks and dinks before they had kids, but maybe sinks and dinks after, because of, you know, once again, the location of services and some of those kinds of things. Okay. All right, so Christopher, that was a long answer to some general things that you might want to look for. All right, difference between language family, language group, language branch. I'll touch on that real quick. So basically, language evolves slowly over time. And we can see similarities in language. And there are very broad similarities and there are very specific similarities. And so, for example, you might, English is what's called a Germanic language, meaning that Germanic languages have more in common than non-Germanic languages. Okay, so if we think of a tree, which is the common analogy, Germanic is one kind of little twig or part of that tree. Okay, so things like English and German and Scandinavian languages like Swedish and Norwegian and Icelandic languages are going to be probably Celtic languages, things like that are going to be a language, I guess, a language family. I'm really not exactly sure on the terminology. What I do know is that those differences are based on the number of similarities. So if you go very specific to dialect is we all speak the same language, we understand each other, it just may sound different, okay? Or we may use some different words, okay? Then you may have Romance languages, so Spanish and French and Italian and things like that are all similar languages. Above that, a bigger umbrella than those are languages that are not really mutually intelligible. So if you know Spanish, you probably understand some French, and you could probably get by with some Italian, okay, because they're similar, right? If you know English, you could probably understand a little bit of German because there's enough similarities, right? That's not true if we're talking about Hindi and English. However, Hindi and English are part of the same language family because, once again, there are similarities. They're not as many and they're not as frequent, but we do see them. So if you watch the video that we did on language, you'll see, especially in the form of cognates, you'll see words that are very similar across a lot of different languages, and that kind of establishes that broader umbrella of similarity might be. Does that make sense? So the idea of that the word mother is madre, is mutter, and then in Hindi it has a very similar sounding cognate, right? So that's how we kind of piece together the idea that these languages are similar. And so as we, I say we, I'm not a linguist. I have no interest in being a linguist. I think it's fascinating, but this is not my thing. Anyway, but the idea being, if we go back and we piece together, and we study languages, and we see these similarities, we can begin to group them together. And we can begin to group them in very specific ways, and into broader ways, and into broader ways. Until we get into, just different things that are completely different altogether, right? So East Asian languages are completely different than Indo-European languages, right? They come from different places. They have a very different evolution. There's few, if any, commonalities. Their alphabets are different, all kinds of things like that. And so those are kind of how those distinctions are created. Okay. So Jeremy Clarkson asked a question about what types of things are FRQs based on. If you go to the very first week's questions, I put a link to an infographic that has some very, very, very cool stuff that shows you what kind of questions they ask, what topics, what verbs, it has lots of information about every question that's ever been asked, and they kind of break that down. Okay. All right. I have a few minutes, so I'm going to try to answer a couple of more questions here. Oh, here's an interesting question here about, can you please explain the type of agriculture found in MDCs as opposed to ones found in LDCs? Okay, this is an interesting question. So, in general, MDCs, most developed countries are going to have commercial agriculture. Okay, their economies have developed to a point where they make food for market, right? Most people in MDCs do not provide their own food. They're not farmers. They may have a garden. You may know someone who lives on a farm and raises some food. That's maybe the case. It's not a very common occurrence. In the United States, 4% of the population is involved in agriculture. All right. So in MDCs, we buy our food. Someone else produces it for us, and we buy it. Not only do we buy it within our own country, but we export massive amounts of food to the rest of the world. Okay. So the United States feeds much of the world. And this is true of Western Europe. This is true of Canada. This is true of Australia to some point. MDCs provide food for themselves and others through market practices. Okay. In LDCs, that is not the case in most of the time. Most LDCs provide agriculture through subsistence, either through things like Sweden, like we talked about before, with shifting cultivation, with slash and burn processes, through intensive subsistence like wet rice production in South Asia and East Asia, through in some places even hunting and gathering, or herding, or pastoralism. So LDCs are more likely to be involved in agriculture based on subsistence and the need to do that. Okay, I highly recommend that you go and find your textbook and see if you can have, I'm almost positive you have a map of agricultural regions. And this will break that down for you. We'll break down where these things are, and where what is, and which group, and what types of agriculture happens in each places. If you take that and you compare it to, a core periphery model map, what you'll see is MDCs are wealthier, and they do income based on, agriculture based on market forces. LDCs do it based on subsistence. Okay, I hope that was Blair. I hope that was a clarification. It was really short and to the point, but those are some general things to think about. Once again, that is something that a visual will go a long way in explaining and kind of seeing how that works. Okay. Cora, I answered your question. Jeremy Clarkson. Oh, Mr. Adams. It's Mr. Adams. Christopher Adams is a teacher. I apologize. Please tell him I did not. I was not aware of that. Although he may have told me that last week and I forgot. I feel bad about that. All right. Let me refresh and see if we have any more questions here. All right. Cora also asked a question about what are the best ways to study. And it's really difficult for me to answer that. And here's a couple of reasons. One is everybody's different. You need to find something that works for you. What I can tell you is, given the volume of what you're looking at, the volume of information, you do not want to try to do it all at once. So what I would recommend is every night, spend 15, 20 minutes looking at vocabulary, looking at models, looking at your notes, okay? I might have three categories. Things I know well, and put that in a category. Things I don't know, things I don't know at all or I'm really confused about, and things I'm kind of about, okay? Spend the most time on those things that you don't know, okay? Spend the most time working on that so that you can really spend time on that. So 10, 15 minutes a day. As you get closer to the test, bump that up 30 minutes a day, 45 minutes a day. As you're getting closer to the test, you're going to be studying more and more and more. Do not wait until the end to do that, okay? I would recommend that you write, okay? Find sample questions, and if nothing else, outline them. Make an outline, okay? Here are the 4 or 5 points that the question's asking for. I'm going to just write everything I know about that for a few minutes, and then do that over and over again. I have a video on how to write an FRQ where I talk about how to make an outline that I think is very useful. I recommend you go look at that. It's in Unit 1, okay? If you have a prep book would be very helpful because it kind of condenses things down. It takes things and kind of cuts out some things that maybe is not necessary. And so if it's things that you know well, a prep book can help you to kind of review those things. I recommend finding some websites, for example, Quizlet, where they may have vocabulary reviews that people have gone on and shared. There are products that you can buy, and I don't necessarily mean you have to buy them, but it's a tool that you can use that have vocabulary flashcards and things like that you may want to think about using. I recommend a study group. Getting together, quizzing each other, asking each other questions and things like that in order to do that. I recommend rereading sections of the book that you're not familiar with. When we talk about models, especially urban models, I found that drawing those is helpful. Using the actual action of writing things commits to memory. So tactile activities and writing actually have a quicker and easier pathway into your long-term memory. So anytime you can write things down or recopy sections of your notes, looking for big ideas, go back and look at the outline that College Board gives every teacher with the course. It's online. You can see what are the big ideas that the College Board expects to be covered, and say, I know this one pretty well. I'm not so sure about this one. Okay, so I would start by breaking it down. Okay, don't look at it as a big, huge, massive thing. Look at it as a lot of things. Okay, and say, which of those lot of things do I feel most comfortable with? Which ones do I not feel comfortable with? And decide how you're going to spend your time. Okay. Your teacher is a great asset to you. Spend as much time as you can with them, asking them questions, searching for the answers to your questions as much as possible. So anyway, but there's lots of ways, and you need to find the things that work best for you. Okay, it can be daunting, it can be intimidating, but it can be done, and I encourage you to spend that time. Okay, if you have decided, if you are one of these people that decided to wait a little too long, I understand that as well. I had lots of students that do that as well. It's never too late to start working and to start getting these things down. The old phrase is, how do you eat an elephant? You eat it one bite at a time. Okay. So those are some things that I would recommend. Anyway, I have, like I said, we're going to continue to do reviews for the next few weeks. We have videos online. We have written resources. We have lots of writing resources. We have sample FRQ questions that you can answer and that you can do. We have sample MCQ questions. They're not as as good or as the same format and quality of test questions, but if nothing else, it's a good quiz opportunity for you there. So I would recommend that you take advantage of all the resources that we have. Take advantage of all the resources that you can get your hands on. Study groups, writing, teacher tutorials. Whatever you need to do. Write songs about it if you need to. If you've got a guitar and playing stuff, write a song about urban models, or write a song about sustainability. I don't know. But anyway, finding the things that work well for you. All right. And I think that's a really good topic on which to end today. So I don't see any new questions in there. Those of you who are going on the field trip tomorrow, have a good time. Enjoy the trip, and I hope you have a good time. I hope you learned something, and I'll be back here 8 o'clock next week. Politics unit is up on the website now, and agriculture will be going up early next week. And please look at those things and come back next week with questions. All right. Thank you, guys.